poverty within or outside of the United States, there are factors such as race, gender, social class, etc., that may contribute to somebody living within poverty. Although economic inequality exists all over the United States, it has been historically higher in southern states and has disproportionately targeted the African American community. And then we have a figure which shows the income within different states, and you can see that the lowest incomes are placed in the South. Economic mobility. So economic mobility is the ability to improve or worsen your economic conditions individually or as a group based on your income and wealth throughout the lifetime or generations. The rural South has the least economic mobility for all demographics within the United States, and compared to other demographics, African Americans have the lowest prospect for upward mobility, and often they experience downward mobility.
This is some data provided on the poverty rates by states that are most affected during 2018 to 2019. These are the 10 most impoverished states, which are largely in the South, with Mississippi at first with 19% and Georgia last with, or 10th with 13.5%. There's still some impacts of slavery today. While African Americans are not the only group that are affected by poverty in the South, they are largely disproportionately affected by the effects of slavery after the Civil War. Slave labor was wrong and evil, but settlers saw slavery as an integral to the social environment in the South. As a result of slavery, African American culture has become an important part of the Southern lifestyle. Economic prosperity of the South at the time was reliant on slave labor for capital. That's me. Impact of slavery on education. After slavery, those affected had zero to little exposure to any schooling. From then on, the only access they had to school was racially segregated public schools, which were mostly in the South, where they received an inferior education even comparatively to other groups in the South, and education in the South is already pretty bad. Private schools, by large, were used by white people in the South, and they were used to uphold racial segregation and separate black students, as black students could not usually afford a public school education, and this gave them a less beneficial education compared to their upper class white people in the South.
So systematic racism and its effects on life to this day. The aftermath of slavery and racial discrimination have persisted throughout time in the form of racial inequalities for the Black community in a number of ways. So we could say, how does systematic racism affect Black communities today? It affects many facets of life, quite literally every facet of life. We chose to discuss 3 in particular, where systematic racism affects Black communities. Structural racism challenges African Americans to participate in society and in the economy. Factors like housing insecurity, the racial wealth gap, education, and policing are examples of racial inequality that are still in the United States today. One of those would be the healthcare system. Compared to white counterparts, African Americans are generally at higher risk for heart diseases, stroke, cancer, asthma, influenza, pneumonia, diabetes, and HIV, according to the Office of Minority Health. Social factors can affect African Americans at younger ages. Unemployment, living in poverty, not owning a home, cost-prohibitive effects of trying to see a doctor, smoking, lifestyle, or obesity are factors. So recently, COVID has affected African Americans more. Many causes are linked to inequalities in healthcare access and poverty. African Americans are experiencing 2.6 times higher cases, 4.7 times higher hospitalization rates, and 2.1 times more deaths from COVID as compared to white counterparts. African Americans on a whole have less access to healthcare, health insurance as compared to other demographics. Although the Affordable Care Act has sparked large coverage gains, some minority groups are still at higher risk of being uninsured, which results in a lack of access to healthcare and experiencing health consequences.
This is a chart explaining that the South is more or less bad with diversity in the public schools. Like you can see that um, there are more black students in the South rather than the North or Midwest, because you see uh, that's where they can afford housing, and that's where the majority of them reside. Racial segregation within schools has been outlawed for years, but they still suffer. Black students still suffer from racial disparities today. Much of education inequality stems from economic mobility issues. A higher education that requires more money would affect and disadvantage groups, especially the African American community. This doesn't just apply to colleges; these apply to all over the age spectrum, and can disadvantage black students from thinking they can be successful. Racial inequalities produce unequal opportunities for educational success. Systematic policies and practices work against children and youth of color to affect their opportunity for achieving success educationally. Racial biases may also play a factor in the education system. Implicit biases and socioeconomic biases exist, and oftentimes students are stereotyped unfairly. Gaps in the high school completion rates are closing, but and Hispanic students are less likely to receive a high school diploma. This has nothing to do with the intelligence, but more to do with the disparities between the poor and the rich students, which creates an education inequality.
Um, Another area we wanted to discuss was the criminal justice system, and it is undisputed that African Americans are disadvantaged unfairly with regards to the criminal justice matters. According to statistics the NAACP examined, although Black people make up 13.4% of the population, they make up 22% of fatal police shootings, 47% of wrongful conviction exonerations, and 35% of individuals executed by the death penalty. The recent protests in America supporting Black Lives Matter have advocated against police brutality against Black people and the racial injustice shown in the criminal justice system. In police stops, sentencing, pretrial detentions, the death penalty, and other areas, enforcement predisproportionately affects African Americans and Latinos. In regards to charges of drug use, racial inequalities in drug arrests and sentencing still exist, even with the more modern understandings within of drug addiction. Police inequalities are not a new subject for generations. Beginning in the time of slavery, overpolicing was prevalent. For example, slave patrols originating in South Carolina in the early 1700s were formed to apprehend escaped slaves and instill fear to stop revolts and riots and to maintain discipline. Despite recent advances and improvements in policing, remnants of the past continue to permeate in society. In a poll, 84% of Black people said that in dealing with police, Black people are generally treated less fairly than whites. 63% of white people said the same. Similarly, 87% of Black people and 61% of white people said that the U.S. criminal justice system treats Black people less fairly. And then ways to improve conditions was to we said that to focus on poverty issues are largely talked about in regards to urban areas. But rarely are rural states, especially in the deep southern states, discussed, and not a lot is done to alleviate these conditions or aid the Black community within the South.
One thing that can be done would be raising the minimum wage. The federal minimum wage is currently at $7.25. Most southern states, including Georgia, Kentucky, and Indiana, have not seen a rise in the minimum wage. Some states have no set minimum wage, and this allows states to pay employees under the rate, at the rate, or above. This can be a problem because if you're not paying your workers what they can make or what they can do with a comfortable living situation, if you're not paying them enough to make rent or pay their bills, it's going to cause housing disparities. And some of these states that don't have any set minimum wage is Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Tennessee. One more thing they can do, or another thing they can do, is reimburse those of ancestors who were slaves. And in 1860, it was estimated that the value done in labor was around $3 billion. African Americans have never been compensated for their economic contributions. There has been past reparations for ethnic minority groups who have been mistreated. In 1988, the Civil Liberties Act, the Chinese internment camp ancestors were paid by the Chinese government. In 1996, class action lawsuit for Native Americans. Native Americans were paid for the mistreatment they received. And some of these arguments go back to President Abraham Lincoln in 1865.
Another policy would be to reform the criminal justice system and to create policies that support successful reentry. So many people find it difficult to transition back into life after returning home from prison. Reentry is really important for those people who are incarcerated, and it gives them a better likelihood of transitioning and reintegrating into society. Reentry programs also provide offenders with job opportunities, which sometimes otherwise wouldn't be available. And reentry programs also provide job training, which can help inmates start a fresh life out of prison. Ending mass incarcerations, the war on drugs and police targeting of young Black men has plagued African American communities by removing people from the workforce. Many employers are refusing to hire people with even minor criminal records, and many parolees are locked out of credit, housing, and education opportunities. Mass incarcerations are disproportionately impacting the poor and people of color. African Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at a rate that is 5.1 times the imprisonment of whites. In 5 states, the disparity is more than 10 to 1. And then in 12 states, more than half of the prison population is Black. And Maryland, whose prison population is 72% African American, tops the nation. And then we have a chart here which shows the incarceration rates in the United States in 2010, and it clearly shows a disparity there. And then our last topic would be to end the poverty tax. The taxation of already low-income households further plummets them into debt and income inequalities. Taxes reduce the resources that poor families have to pay for additional child support and care and transportation expenses that they pay for as they strive to work their way out of poverty. I don't